Hey guys, welcome to chapter 2. I hope that last week went okay for you. I haven't heard much from anybody, so I guess no news is good news. This week, chapter 2 is a very comprehensive chapter, sort of walking through the process of how students end up qualifying for special education and what does that mean if they receive special education. There's lots of different areas and terminology, and so this is a very dense chapter, I think, but hopefully you will understand it after you read it and or watch this video, and if not, you're more than welcome to come in and chat about it further. I'm always here during the week, different times, but I'd be happy to talk to you about it. So anyways, I'm just going to sort of walk us through the PowerPoint for those of you who find it more beneficial to hear me sort of explain it rather than just reading it independently. Okay, the first thing we're going to talk about is that IDEA, which we sort of touched on last week. There's ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that covers anybody with a disability. And then IDEA is sort of underneath ADA, and that protects the education, Individuals with Disability Education Act. So that E sort of stands for education. There's a couple different things in terms of IDEA that we talk about for having a student qualify for special education. The first one is called Child Find. And what that says is that any professional has the obligation to mention it to a parent or another professional within the field under the HIPAA rules, either way, if they suspect a disability. So that covers, like when my son was young, like 18 months, I had to continue every well check to fill out a developmental checklist, and if there was anything that they were worried about, they would call. And so when Zach was 18 months old, he had his checkup, and then my daughter was going to be born, scheduled C-section, the next day after his checkup. And so at the doctor's appointment, my doctor mentioned that he thought that he should be evaluated for speech therapy and gave me a pamphlet for first steps. And, obviously I thanked him. And in my mind, I thought, I'll call next week or the following week or something like that after things settle down with the new baby. Well, later on that day, probably 2 or 3 hours later, I got a call from First Steps saying that my doctor referred them and they need to go ahead and start the process for getting him evaluated. And so the point of that whole story is Child Find is regulated by the government, saying if somebody suspects a disability, there must be steps that happen immediately to protect that child and identify that child. So they're all mandated by the amount of time that things happen. So from the time the doctor refers the child, then the agency, which happened to be First Steps, has so many days to contact the parent, and then they have so many days to get an evaluation done, and then they have so many days to get the results back to the family. So Child Find happens from the moment you're born. If there's a suspected disability, a professional has to take the proper steps. So then we move on to a referral. So if you suspect a child has a disability, then you have to fill out a referral. And the referral sort of says, we have tried to remediate this issue and it's still happening, and I am professionally out of steps. And so I think there might be a suspected disability. So what that means at a young age is, I've given all the medication, or the parents have done everything they can do at home. The child's still not talking, the child's still not walking. I think that they should be referred for special ed. In the school system, what it is I've taught him, I've given him small group, I've given him extra time, he's still not learning to read, I think there's a disability. And so the referral says, I've tried all of these different things, and now it's time to refer. Then once the referral happens, there's usually a meeting to say what's going on, and there's lots of different professionals in the room, and everybody sort of talks about what they might suspect the child would have, and then we determine what we have to evaluate. So obviously, if we suspect the child has a speech and a language difficulty, we don't need to evaluate them on their motor skills, because they can walk and run just fine, but they're not talking yet. However, they could be talking and not walking yet, so the evaluation would need to be more of a motor evaluation than a speech evaluation. So from that referral meeting, we determine which tests do we need to do. And the testing part is the evaluation. So which sort of standard-based tests are we doing to evaluate to see if they have this disability? And then the very last step is the eligibility determination. And usually, in Kentucky at least, in the school system, for every disability, there's a form, an eligibility determination form that says, yes, we've done this, and yes, we've done this, and yes, we've done this. And the scores on the evaluation support the fact that this child has a learning disability or an intellectual disability or whatever that might be. So the results from the evaluation come in, everybody meets again, and they determine, does that child qualify, or maybe it's sort of on pause and we are going to go back and evaluate some more and do some more data and then meet again. So it could be that, but they determine if the child does or does not have a disability. All right, then we sort of get into the RTI system, and this is how the RTI system should work. Not all schools do RTI like they should, but ideally it should be run this way. Now, RTI is explained several different ways, but I'm going to explain the way that I understand it to be used most often in Kentucky. RTI stands for Response Intervention. What that's supposed to be is sort of a safety net. So if a child is struggling, can we give them the extra supports to help them get back on track? And if the extra supports help, perfect. That's what they're meant to do. Or maybe we're trying to give them the extra supports and they're still not making progress, and then they probably might have a disability. So it's sort of like, I guess, if you, I don't know, if you dive out of a speedboat to go swimming, and the intervention, you can't swim back to the boat. The intervention might be to like toss you a life jacket. You put the life jacket on and you can swim back to the boat. If you can't do that with your life jacket, then maybe we need to throw out a buoy and just pull you in all the way. So it's sort of like multiple tiers to say, if we help you, can you do it? Or you can't do it at all and I have to do it for you. So RTI is done for two things, and we need to remember these things. It can be both for academic or it can be for behavior. So typically in the school system, if they're doing RTI academically, they're doing RTI reading, that's when you'll see most often, RTI math, and sometimes RTI writing. And then there's also RTI behavior, and most of you have probably heard about it and just don't realize it, but it's called PBIS. And that is the system for behavior. So a lot of the schools, if you're out in your field placement, you can ask what's their PBIS or what's their RTI for behavior, and they should be able to tell you that. Usually, all of these multiple tiers are used so that when we identify a child with a disability, we can see what interventions have been given and why they worked or why they didn't work. There's different assessment practices, and so you'll see this through other activities, but there's things like progress monitoring, there's screenings, there's ATM meetings, so typically 3 times a year, children do a screener, which it says right here. So a screener is like one brief overarching test, and a lot of you have probably heard of it with screeners like the MAPS testing or STAR testing on Renaissance Place. What else do they have as screeners? Let me think. Terra Nova is another one. And those are screeners that the whole school does. Actually, every child in the school does it 3 times a year. At the beginning of the year, middle of the year, usually right after Christmas break, and then towards the end of the year. And when we get the screener back, usually we look at the bottom 20% of the class, or we look at the data that shows that they're below grade level, and we pull those students out and we say, these students need some further help. And then the students that need further help, we put into RTI. So all students get a screener, okay, 3 times a year. Progress monitoring only happens with that group of students that are in the RTI. They're getting the extra intervention. And progress monitoring should happen weekly or bi-weekly. And what it is it's just a quick measure to say, how are they doing? Is the intervention working? Because if you're doing something for a while and the child's not making any progress, then what you're doing is not working, and there has to be a way to evaluate that. So progress monitoring is what we're using with that group of students that are getting the intervention, and we're doing it frequently to see how their progress is on the intervention. The sad part, though, about RTI is that even after all the research, there's not a lot of evidence to support that it is or isn't helping. So we assume that it is helping, but there's not research that says it's definitely changed the trajectory or the number prevalence of students that are in special education, which is just sort of interesting. So here are the three models. One example. So one example is tier one. That's every single person. That's your core instruction. All the students are getting it, and that's where we screen all the students. So everybody gets a screener, and we make sure that they're getting good, solid core instruction. Now, if they're not, and the screener shows they're behind grade level, then we would move them to tier two. And tier two is usually 20 to 30 minutes of a smaller intervention. So sometimes it could be on a computer doing a thing called like Success Maker or Fast Forward or what is the Read 180? There's lots of them. Or it could just be small reading groups with your teacher once a day, 20 to 30 minutes. Okay. Now, if you're doing that once a day for 20 to 30 minutes and you're still not making any progress after a while, usually it's 2 or 3 screening sessions, which would be half a year or a whole year. If you're not making any progress, then usually, well, this model will say that the multidisciplinary team will convene and develop an IEP. This is typically not in the classroom, or in Kentucky public schools at least, this is not the tier model that they're using. This is the tier model that our book explains. This is the tier model here that Kentucky is using. So tier one is all students. Tier two is that first targeted intervention. If they're not making progress, then they get tier three. So they're getting their core reading, and then they're getting a small reading group, and then they're getting another small reading group. So what this looked like in one of my elementary schools was that they did their reading class, and then they had RTI block after reading, and so they would go do Fast Forward for 20 minutes, and then they would have a small reading group with the reading intervention teacher for another 30 minutes or 20 minutes, and so they just kind of like rotated, but they had multiple interventions happening. Now, if they haven't made progress there, that's when they usually refer for special education. But keep in mind, they meet about every 12 weeks when they do a screener, and they don't discuss progress. So a student could be tier two, round 4 in something. And let me see if I can explain that a little bit better. So I guess here I don't have a good graph, but with your progress monitoring, you continue to take data, and then there's a screener. So you would draw a line at Christmas time when they did the screener, and you would say, how did they do? Are they making progress or are they not? If they're making progress, then they're in tier 2, round 1. Then you're going to keep them in tier 2. So right after this screener, it's tier 2, round 2. And then they keep going until the end of the year screener, and then you draw another line. Are they making progress or not? So then if they are, making a little bit of progress, but they're still struggling, then they're in tier 2, round 3. So sometimes, I know that's really confusing, but sometimes you'll ask, how long have they been in RTI, or what round are they in? And the teacher will say like, oh, they're tier 3, round 4, which means that they've gone through a lot of interventions. And they're continuing to not make progress, but they're making enough progress to leave them in that RTI system. So this is just a quick way that the book explains it. But like I said, this one is more the Kentucky-based model where tier 3 is an extra intervention. And then other places, like our book explains tier 3 is special education, and that's not always the case. So it just depends on your state and the way that they model it, but there's always only 3 tiers. So just make sure that you understand that. And then I'm going to pause this because it'll only let me go 15 minutes, and I will pick up the next one in just a second.